The rancher tasted her cornbread, then saw the woman everyone had forgotten. The first thing Seth Caldwell noticed was not her face, but the way every man in the dining room ignored her. She moved between the tables like a shadow in a brown dress, carrying plates, filling cups, and stepping away before anyone could thank her. Men took food from her hands without looking up. Women asked for extra coffee like she was part of the wall. Even the owner of the boarding house called her from the kitchen with the same careless voice, a man used for a broom or a bucket. But then Seth tasted the cornbread. He had come into Red Hollow that afternoon with dust on his coat, a tired horse tied outside, and a hunger that had followed him since sunrise. The Caldwell Ranch sat 7 miles east of town, past the dry creek and the low ridge where the wind never seemed to rest. He had spent the day moving cattle from one poor patch of grass to another, and by the time he pushed open the boarding house door, he wanted nothing more than a hot meal and silence. The room smelled of stew, wood smoke, and wet wool. Rain had passed through town earlier, leaving mud in the street and damp hats on every peg by the door. Seth chose a corner table and sat with his back near the wall, the way his father had taught him before dying with debts in one hand and land papers in the other. A round-faced man behind the counter looked up from counting coins. "Stew's all that's left," he said. "That'll do," Seth answered. The man nodded toward the kitchen. "Mara, one more plate." A moment later, she came out. Mara Bell was not what men in Red Hollow turned their heads for. Her dress was plain. Her dark hair was pinned tight, though a few loose strands had escaped near her cheek. A small burn mark showed on the back of one hand, and flour dust clung to the edge of her sleeve. Her eyes stayed lowered, not weakly, but carefully, like a woman who had learned that being noticed often cost more than being forgotten. She set the bowl before him. "Bread?" she asked softly. Seth looked at the small iron plate in her other hand. "If there's any." She placed 2 pieces of cornbread beside his bowl, then stepped back at once, as if she expected him to wave her away. Seth broke off a piece and took one bite. The room did not change. The rain still dripped from the porch roof. The card players in the far corner still argued over a nickel. The boarding house owner still scratched numbers into his book, but something shifted inside Seth so suddenly that he stopped chewing. The cornbread was warm, crisp at the edge, soft in the middle, with a faint sweetness that tasted like someone had taken care with it instead of merely making food. It was not fancy. It was not rich, but it had a kindness in it, a strange thing to think about bread, yet Seth could not find another word. He looked up. Mara was already turning away. "Ma'am," he said. She stopped but did not face him fully. "This is the best cornbread I've had in years." A few men near the stove gave lazy smiles, as if Seth had made a joke. The owner snorted without looking up. "Mara makes too much when she's nervous," he said. "Better somebody eats it." Mara's fingers tightened around the empty plate. Seth watched that small movement. He had worked cattle long enough to know when a creature flinched before the rope even touched it. Mara did not flinch with her whole body. Only her hand did it. That made it worse. "I meant what I said," Seth told her. This time she looked at him. Only for a breath. Her eyes were gray, tired, and guarded, but behind them there was a quick flash of something he could not name. Not pride, not happiness, more like disbelief that had learned to hide itself fast. "Thank you," she said. Then she walked back into the kitchen. Seth finished his meal slower than he meant to. Every time the kitchen door swung open, he looked up, though he told himself he was only waiting for more coffee. Mara came and went but never stayed. She moved around the room with quiet skill, knowing which man wanted salt, which child needed a smaller spoon, which old woman's tea had gone cold. She saw everyone. No one saw her. By the time Seth stepped outside, the clouds had broken apart over Red Hollow. Sunlight touched the wet street and turned the mud gold in places. His bay horse, Juniper, shifted near the rail and blew softly through her nose. Seth untied the reins but did not mount. Across the street, through the side alley by the boarding house, he saw Mara come out with a basket of scraps. A small boy stood near the rain barrel, barefoot in mud too cold for bare feet. Seth recognized him as the youngest Miller child from the poorer end of town. Mara looked around once, then pulled something from beneath the cloth in her basket. A piece of cornbread. Not a scrap, a full piece. She knelt and handed it to the boy. The child took it with both hands and stared at it as if it were Christmas morning. Mara smiled then, not the tight, careful expression she wore inside, but a real smile that softened her whole face. It was quick, private, and gone too soon. Mara. The boarding house owner's voice cracked through the alley. She rose at once. The boy hid the bread against his chest. Mara brushed mud from her skirt and went back inside without answering. Seth stood beside his horse, one hand still on the reins. He had come to town for nails, salt, and a meal. He left with all three, yet the only thing he carried home in his mind was the look on Mara Bell's face when someone finally said her work mattered. That evening, as he rode back toward the Caldwell ranch, the sky turned purple over the long grass. The smell of rain lifted from the earth. Juniper picked her way through puddles while Seth sat quiet in the saddle. He had spent most of his 29 years believing a man could lose a great deal and still keep moving if he did not ask too much from life. His mother had died when he was 16. His father had worked himself into the grave 10 years later. The woman Seth once planned to marry had chosen a banker from Abilene because he owned clean shirts and did not smell of cattle. Since then, Seth had kept his heart like a locked tack room. Useful. Orderly. Closed. But that night, with the taste of warm cornbread still in his memory, he found himself thinking about a quiet woman in a brown dress who fed everyone else first and seemed to expect nothing back. And for the first time in many years, Seth Caldwell wondered what kind of hunger had nothing to do with food. By the next morning, Seth told himself he had no reason to think about the boarding house cook. A man with 80 head of cattle to move, a broken windmill to mend, and 2 ranch hands arguing over fence wire had no business wondering whether a woman in town had eaten supper after feeding everyone else. Yet the thought stayed with him through breakfast, through the morning chores, and through the long hour he spent knee-deep in mud trying to fix a gate that had sagged after the rain. By noon, he was angry at himself for it. "Something biting you?" asked Amos Pike, his oldest ranch hand. Seth pulled a nail from his mouth and hammered it hard into the gate post. "Just this gate." Amos looked at the gate, then at Seth. "That gate ain't done nothing to deserve that." Seth said nothing. Amos had worked the Caldwell place since Seth was a boy. He had gray in his beard, a limp from an old horse fall, and the kind of eyes that saw more than a man invited him to. He did not ask another question, but Seth felt the old man's quiet smile behind him all the way back to the barn. 2 days passed before Seth went back to Red Hollow. He told himself the trip was necessary. The ranch needed lamp oil. The ranch needed sugar. The ranch needed a new hinge for the smokehouse door. None of those things were lies, but they did not explain why he hitched Juniper before the sun had fully climbed and rode into town with his shirt brushed clean. The boarding house was busy when he arrived. A stage had come through early, leaving travelers with damp coats, tired faces, and loud voices. Seth stepped inside and found every table full except one near the back window. He took it and waited. Mara came out carrying a tray of bowls. She did not see him at first. She moved around a chair, set stew before 2 miners, filled a woman's cup, then turned. Their eyes met. Only for a moment. Then she looked away so quickly that Seth almost wondered if he had imagined the small start in her face. "Afternoon," he said when she reached his table. "Afternoon, Mr. Caldwell. You know my name. Most people know your name." "That's so." She set the bowl down. "You own the East Ranch." "My father owned it first. But it is yours now." There was no envy in her voice, no flattery either, only plain fact. Seth found he liked that. "And you're Miss Bell," he said. Her hand paused on the coffee pot. "Myra is fine." "Then Seth is fine." She looked at him again, and this time a faint line formed between her brows, as if kindness had become a puzzle she did not care to solve in public. Behind the counter, Silas Greer, the boarding house owner, shut his ledger with a sharp slap. "Mara, don't stand there visiting. Table 3 needs bread." The softness left her face. "Yes, sir." She turned away. Seth watched her cross the room. Greer was not cruel in any loud way. He did not shout with rage or raise a hand. He was worse in the way some men were worse. He made a person small one ordinary word at a time, then acted surprised when they stopped standing tall. Seth ate his stew, but he hardly tasted it. When Mara returned with coffee, he asked, "Do you ever sit down while you work?" She looked toward Greer before answering. "Not much work gets done sitting." "That was not my question." "No," she said quietly, "I don't." The answer settled between them. Before Seth could say more, a little girl at the next table knocked over her cup. Coffee spilled across the boards and dripped toward her mother's skirt. The mother gasped, the child froze, and Greer groaned as if the child had broken a window. Mara was there at once. "It's all right," she said, kneeling with a cloth. "No harm done." The little girl's lip trembled. "I'm sorry." Mara's voice changed. It went gentle in a way Seth had heard only once before, in the alley with the Miller boy. "Cups fall sometimes. That's why tables are made strong." The child gave a weak smile. Mara cleaned the spill, then slipped a small piece of cornbread onto the child's plate as if it had been there all along. Seth saw it. So did Greer. Myra. The name came cold. She stood with the wet cloth in her hand. Greer walked from behind the counter, slow and heavy, making sure the room noticed him. "That bread is counted." The girl's mother flushed red. "I'll pay for it." Greer did not look at her. His eyes stayed on Mara. "It was not yours to give." Mara's face closed. Seth rose before he decided to. The chair scraped loudly in the quiet room. "I'll pay for every piece of cornbread on that table," he said. Greer turned. "No need for that, Mr. Caldwell." "There is need if you are counting kindness like it is stolen silver." A few men looked down at their bowls. Someone near the stove coughed. Mara stared at the floor. Greer's mouth tightened into a smile that held no warmth. "You misunderstand. I run a business." "And she runs the room," Seth said. "You do well to notice." For one breath, nobody moved. Then Greer laughed, but it was thin. "Enjoy your meal." He went back to his ledger. Sound returned slowly to the room, one spoon, one chair, one low voice at a time. Mara did not thank Seth. She did not look grateful. If anything, she looked frightened that he had made her visible in the worst possible way. When she came to clear his bowl, her voice was so low he nearly missed it. "You should not have done that. He had no right speaking to you so. He owns the place. He does not own you." Her fingers tightened around the bowl. Seth wished at once he had said it softer. The words had struck something deeper than he meant them to. Mara looked toward the kitchen door. "Some folks do not need ownership papers to make you feel like they do." Then she was gone. Seth stood outside a few minutes later with his purchases tied behind the saddle and his heart unsettled. The street had dried since morning. Wagon wheels had cut hard lines through the mud. Across the way, children chased each other near the mercantile, laughing as if the world had never once been unkind. The boarding house door opened behind him. Seth turned, expecting Mara. It was Greer. The man stepped onto the porch and leaned one shoulder against the post. "She's not your concern, Caldwell." Seth kept his hand on Juniper's reins. "I did not say she was." "You did not have to." Greer's eyes narrowed. "Pretty thing pity makes a man think he is noble." Seth's jaw tightened. Greer lowered his voice. "But that woman has a past, and pasts follow. Some doors are better left closed." Seth looked toward the kitchen window. For the first time, he saw Mara standing just inside the glass, still as a held breath. Her face told him she had heard every word. And what frightened Seth most was not the warning in Greer's voice. It was the shame in hers. Seth did not sleep well that night. Greer's warning kept walking through his mind like a bootstep on loose boards. That woman has a past. Some doors are better left closed. Seth had heard men use that kind of sentence before. It was the sort of sentence that sounded wise only because it left out the truth. By dawn, he was in the barn, brushing Juniper with more force than needed. Amos Pike came in carrying a coil of rope over one shoulder. He watched Seth for a moment, then said, "That horse is clean enough to attend church." Seth slowed his hand. Amos leaned against a stall post. "Trouble in town?" "No. Woman in town." Seth looked at him. The old hand smiled faintly. "That means yes." Seth hung the brush on its nail. "You ever hear of Mara Bell?" Amos's face changed, not much but enough. His smile faded. "She works at Greer's place." "I know where she works." "Then what are you asking?" Seth stepped out of the stall and lowered his voice. "Greer said she had a past." Amos looked toward the open barn door, where morning light lay pale across the yard. "Everybody has a past. Not everybody gets warned about like a storm cloud." The old man rubbed one thumb across the rope in his hand. "I don't know much. Heard she came out of the county orphan home years back. Worked kitchens since she was old enough to carry water. Folks say she was once taken in by a family west of Cedar Gap." "What happened?" "Nothing good if the talk is true." Amos's eyes lifted. "And talk usually gets worse the farther it travels." Seth waited. Amos sighed. "A man named Lyle Voss took her on as kitchen help. His wife had died. He had 2 boys, both mean as thorns. One winter, Voss claimed money went missing from a locked drawer. Said the girl stole it. She denied it. Nobody listened. He sent her back to the orphan home with 1 dress and no wages." Seth's mouth tightened. "Was it true?" "Never found out. Men like Voss do not look kindly on being questioned." Seth thought of Mara's lowered eyes, her careful hands, the way she gave bread to hungry children as if doing it secretly was safer than doing it openly. "Where is Voss now?" "Dead 2 years. His older boy runs a freight line. Younger one drifts around saloons and trouble." Amos paused. "Why are you asking after her?" Seth looked toward the house. The windows were dark except for 1 lamp the cook had left burning before bed. The Caldwell ranch was a good place, but it was empty in corners no broom could reach. "I don't like seeing a person treated like they already lost a trial no one held." Amos nodded slowly. "Then be careful. A kind man can still scare a woman if the world taught her kindness comes with a hook." Those words stayed with Seth all day. He went to Red Hollow again that afternoon, but this time he did not go straight to the boarding house. He stopped at the mercantile first, bought flour, coffee, and a small packet of dried apples he did not need. Old Mrs. Rusk sat near the door with knitting in her lap, watching the town through sharp blue eyes. "Seth Caldwell," she said, "you have bought more flour in 1 week than a man alone can use in a month." Ranch hands eat. Ranch hands do not bake pies. I did not buy pie flour. All flour can become pie if the right woman touches it. Seth nearly dropped the coffee sack. Mrs. Rusk smiled down at her knitting. Do not stand there looking guilty. I am old, not blind. He tipped his hat and left before she could say more. When he entered the boarding house, the dinner crowd was smaller than usual. Greer stood behind the counter. Mara was wiping a table near the window, sleeves rolled to her elbows, a loose strand of hair resting against her cheek. Seth removed his hat. Afternoon, Mara. She straightened. Mr. Caldwell. Seth, he reminded gently. Her eyes moved to Greer, then back. Seth. The sound of his name and her voice did something quiet to him. Greer's pen stopped moving. Seth ordered supper. Mara brought it with cornbread, though her movements were more guarded than before. When she turned to leave, he said, I owe you an apology. She froze. For what I said yesterday, about him not owning you. It was true, but I should not have thrown the words at you like that. Mara held the empty tray against her waist. The room was too public for a real answer, and Seth knew it. Still, something in her face softened by the smallest measure. You were not wrong, she said. That does not mean I was careful. She looked at him then, longer than she had before. Outside, a wagon rolled past, rattling the window glass. Somewhere in the kitchen, a pot lid clattered. For a moment, the boarding house seemed to hold its breath. Then Greer called from the counter, Mara, kitchen. The moment broke. She stepped away. Seth finished his meal, but he did not leave at once. He waited until the room thinned, until Greer went to the back room with his ledger, until the last traveler climbed the stairs. Mara came out carrying a bucket of wash water. Seth stood. Let me take that. No. The answer came too quickly. He lifted both hands, showing he would not touch the bucket. All right. Her shoulders eased, but only a little. I meant no harm, he said. I know, her voice was low. That is sometimes what makes it harder. Seth understood then that Amos had been right. Kindness could frighten a person when every soft thing in life had hidden a sharp edge. Mara looked down at the bucket. Folks help when they want something. Not always. That is what everyone says before the wanting starts. The words were plain, not bitter. That made them hurt more. If this moment touched your heart, stay with the story, because Mara's truth is only beginning to rise from the dust. Seth did not argue. He only reached into his coat pocket and set the packet of dried apples on the nearest table. These are for the kitchen, he said, no favor tied to them. Mara stared at the packet as though it might move. I cannot take gifts. It is not a gift, it is payment. For what? For the best cornbread in Red Hollow. A faint, unwilling smile touched her mouth before she hid it. Then Greer's voice came from the dark hall behind her. Mara Bell, step away from that man. Seth turned slowly. Greer stood in the hallway with a folded paper in his hand. His face looked pale in the lamplight, but his eyes were sharp and cold. I warned you, Caldwell, Greer said, and since you will not listen, maybe the town should. He lifted the paper high enough for Seth to see the old county seal at the bottom. Mara's face went white. And Seth knew at once that whatever past Greer had spoken of, he had just brought it back into the room. The paper in Sela's Greer's hand looked small, but it changed the air in the boarding house. Mara stood near the table with the wash bucket at her feet, her face white, her hands still. Seth had seen cattle freeze that way before a storm broke over the ridge, not because they did not know danger was coming, but because they knew it too well. Greer stepped farther into the room. This is a notice from Cedar Gap, he said, tapping the paper with 2 fingers. Old complaint against Mara Bell, theft from a household that took her in, money from a locked drawer. Mara's lips parted, but no sound came. Seth felt heat rise in his chest. That paper looks years old. Truth does not spoil with age, Greer said. Neither do lies if men keep feeding them. Greer's eyes narrowed. Careful, Caldwell. The kitchen girl standing in the doorway crossed herself softly. A traveling salesman at the far table bent over his plate as if supper had suddenly become the most important thing in the world. Nobody wanted to be part of a fight that smelled of old shame. Seth looked at Mara. Is it true? The question struck her harder than he meant it to. Her eyes lifted, wounded and sharp. No, she whispered. That was all. One word. But Seth believed it before he had time to decide. Greer gave a dry laugh. Of course she says no. She said no then too. Seth stepped toward him. And who asked the drawer how it opened? Who asked who else had the key? Who asked why a girl with no place to go would steal money from the only roof over her head? Greer's mouth tightened. Mara bent suddenly and grabbed the bucket handle. I have work, she said. Her voice had gone flat, empty. She moved toward the kitchen, but Seth stepped aside before she had to ask him to. He would not trap her in the middle of men's words. As she passed, he saw tears in her eyes that she refused to let fall. The kitchen door swung shut behind her. Greer folded the paper with slow care. You think you are the first man to feel sorry for her. Seth picked up his hat from the chair. No, he said, but I might be the first who listened. He left the boarding house before anger made him say something he could not take back. Outside, the night had settled over Red Hollow. Lanterns burned in windows. The mud had hardened into dark ridges under wagon wheels. Seth stood beneath the porch awning and drew a long breath, trying to quiet the storm inside him. A man could not fix a life by being angry for one night. He knew that, yet the sight of Mara's face would not leave him. He crossed the street to the livery, saddled Juniper, and rode out under a sky full of hard stars. But he did not ride home. He rode north. Cedar Gap lay 12 miles beyond Red Hollow, a smaller town tucked between low hills and cottonwood trees. The road was dark and uneven, but Seth knew enough of it from cattle sales and winter supply runs. By the time he reached it, most lamps were out. The sheriff's office had one yellow light burning in the window. Sheriff Nolan Brand sat inside with boots on his desk, reading an old newspaper. He looked up when Seth entered. Caldwell, he said, you lose cattle. No. Horse stolen. No. Then either you killed a man or you want a favor. I want to ask about a complaint from years back. The sheriff lowered the paper. At this hour. At this hour. Nolan studied him, then swung his boots down. Name. Mara Bell. The sheriff's face shifted with recognition, but not surprise. He stood and went to a shelf behind the desk. That poor girl, he muttered. Seth's hands closed at his sides. You know the matter. I know enough to dislike it. Nolan pulled a thin folder from a stack and opened it on the desk. The paper inside was worn at the edges. Seth leaned in, reading what he could in the lamplight. Complaint filed by Lyle Voss. Missing sum of $23. Servant girl suspected. No formal charge. No trial. No recovery of money. Seth looked up. No formal charge. None. Then why is Greer carrying a notice like it proves something? The sheriff's jaw moved. Because some men do not need law when gossip serves cheaper. Was she cleared? Nolan sighed. She was never charged, so there was nothing to clear. But that is the trouble with stains like this. They spread even when there is no ink. Seth read the page again. Who else lived in that house? Voss and his two sons. Caleb Voss was 17 then. Ben was 14. The older one left town after his father died. The younger one still comes through when he needs drink or money. Where is Ben now? Nolan's eyes sharpened. Why? Because a locked drawer does not empty itself. The sheriff closed the folder. Careful, Seth. Old trouble has roots. Pull one and half the ground may come loose. Seth looked out the window at the dark street. Somewhere far behind him, Mara was probably scrubbing Greer's pans as if work could wash shame off her name. Maybe the ground needs loosening, he said. He rode back near dawn. The Caldwell ranch was waking when he reached it. Smoke lifted from the bunkhouse stove. Amos was leading horses from the corral and stopped when he saw Seth's tired face. You look like a man who went digging and found bone. Seth dismounted slowly. Mara was never charged. Amos nodded as if the news pained him more than it surprised him. She carried the shame anyway, Seth said. Women like her often do. Seth handed him Juniper's reins. I need a cook. Amos blinked. We have a cook. We have a man who burns beans and calls it supper. That is true. Seth looked toward the east, where the sun had begun to rise over the cold grass. I'm going to offer Mara honest wages, her own cabin, and a place where no one speaks her past over her shoulder. Amos was quiet a moment, and if she says no. Seth thought of Mara's eyes when he asked if the accusation was true. Then I will still make sure Red Hollow knows that paper proves nothing. By noon, Seth rode back into town with dust on his coat, no sleep in his eyes, and a decision sitting firm in his chest. But when he reached the boarding house, Mara was not in the dining room. The kitchen door hung open. The stove was cold. And Silas Greer stood behind the counter, with a look on his face that told Seth something had happened before he ever said the words. She left before sunrise, Greer said. Seth's hand tightened around his hat. And for the first time since tasting that cornbread, he was afraid he had seen Mara Bell only long enough to lose her. Seth did not ask Greer a second time. He could see the answer before the man finished enjoying it. Mara was gone, and Greer liked that Seth had arrived too late. Where did she go? Seth asked. Greer wiped the counter with a cloth that was already clean. A grown woman can walk where she pleases. She left her wages. That made Greer's hand slow. Seth stepped closer. Did she? Greer's mouth pressed into a thin line. She owed for room and board. She worked for both. And I kept an account. Seth looked at the ledger on the shelf behind him. In that moment, he understood how easy it was for a man with ink and numbers to turn work into debt, hunger into fault, and a woman's silence into proof. You will show me that account, Seth said. Greer laughed once. You have no right. No, but Sheriff Brand might. The laugh went out of Greer's face. Seth did not wait for more. He crossed to the kitchen door. Greer called after him, but Seth stepped inside anyway. The kitchen looked wrong without Mara in it. A pan sat drying near the stove. A flour sack leaned against the wall, tied with the same tight knot she always used. The worktable had been scrubbed so clean the wood looked pale in the morning light. Seth saw no trunk, no shawl, no sign of a woman taking her time to leave. Then he noticed the small square of cloth on the table. It was folded once and weighted with a tin measuring cup. Seth picked it up. Inside were 2 pieces of cornbread, wrapped carefully, still faintly warm at the center. For a strange second the room blurred. She had left before sunrise, frightened or ashamed or both, and still she had baked bread before going. Not for customers, not for Greer, maybe for no one at all, maybe because the work was the only steady thing she trusted. A kitchen girl, younger than Mara and thin as a fence rail, stood in the back doorway. She went south, the girl whispered. Seth turned when? Before first light. Took the creek road. Mr. Greer told her if trouble came because of that paper, he would not have her name hurting his house. Seth's jaw tightened. Did she say where she was going? The girl shook her head. She asked if the Miller boy's fever had passed. Then she gave me her apron and said I should keep the stove low until the biscuits set. Seth held the cloth in his hand. Even leaving, Mara had thought of a sick child in an oven. Thank you, he said. The girl looked toward the dining room, afraid Greer might hear. She ain't what they say. I know. Seth left by the kitchen door and was in the saddle before Greer could come out front. The creek road south of town was narrow and rutted, winding between cottonwoods and patches of dry grass. Seth rode hard at first, then slowed when he found tracks, wagon wheels, one woman's boot marks beside them where the mud had been soft. She was not riding, she was walking. That made something twist in him. Juniper tossed her head as the road dipped toward the water. A hawk circled above the ridge. Far off, thunder rolled though the sky was clear, the sound of a late storm breaking somewhere beyond the hills. By mid-morning, Seth found her. Mara stood beside a broken wagon half a mile beyond the old stone crossing. The wagon belonged to the Miller family, the same poor widow whose boy Mara had fed in the alley. One wheel had sunk deep into mud near the creek bank. Mrs. Miller was trying to calm a crying baby while two children watched with wide eyes. Mara had her sleeves rolled up in both hands on the wagon spoke, pushing with all the strength in her small frame. She looked up when Seth rode close. For a moment, fear crossed her face. Then pride covered it. You should not have followed me, she said. Seth dismounted. Looks like I followed the right road. Mrs. Miller turned with relief. Mr. Caldwell, if you can help with this wheel, I would be obliged. Seth nodded, I can. He did not ask Mara to move. He stepped beside her, put his shoulder to the wagon, and spoke to the oldest Miller boy. When I say push, you push low, not high. Low moves the wheel. The boy nodded hard. Together they strained against the stuck wagon. Mud sucked at the rim. The baby cried louder. Mara's breath shook, but she did not let go. Seth could feel her effort beside him, fierce and quiet. Now, he said. The wheel lurched free. The children cheered as if someone had won a war. Mrs. Miller wiped her eyes with the corner of her shawl. Mara stepped back, mud up the side of her skirt, hair loose at her neck. Seth wanted to tell her she looked brave, but he had already learned that praise could feel like a hand reaching too fast. So he only said, You all right? She looked away. I am not hurt. That is not what I asked. Her face softened, then closed again. Mrs. Miller came near and took Mara's hands. You come with us to my sister S. We'll make room. Mara shook her head. You have enough mouths. You helped mine. I helped with a wheel. You helped with more than that. The widow's words hung in the air, plain and true. Mara pulled her hands back gently. Seth waited until Mrs. Miller had gathered the children and started the wagon forward. Then he turned to Mara. I went to Cedar Gap. Her eyes snapped to his. I saw the complaint. No charge, no trial, no proof. The color left her cheeks. You had no right digging in that. I know. Then why did you? Because Greer was using it like a chain. Mara looked down at the mud on her boots. Chains work best when other folks agree they are there. Seth took a slow breath. Come work at my ranch. She laughed softly, but there was no joy in it. That is what this is. It is honest work, honest wages, your own cabin, a lock from the inside. Nobody will call you thief under my roof. Her eyes shone, but her voice stayed careful. And what will folks say? Folks talk when the wind changes. They will say you took pity on a stained woman. I do not care. I do, she whispered. The words stopped him. Mara looked toward the creek, where sunlight broke across the shallow water. You can ride back to your ranch and decide not to care. I have to live in what they say. I have lived in it since I was 16. Seth had no answer good enough. If you believe a person deserves a second chance before the world knows the whole truth, stay with this story, because Mara has carried more than one secret down this road. A horse sounded behind them. Both turned. A rider came from the north, moving fast along the creek road. Seth recognized the slumped shoulders, the dusty black coat, and the narrow face before the man pulled close. Amos had told him the name. Ben Voss. Mara saw him too. This time she did not hide her fear. The rider stopped 10 yards away and smiled at her like he had found something he had lost. Well now, Ben said, I heard Red Hollow finally remembered your name. Ben Voss sat on his horse with one hand resting on the saddle horn, smiling as if the creek road belonged to him. Mara did not move. Seth had seen fear in many forms on the frontier, a horse spooking at lightning, a young hand facing his first stampede, a mother hearing a cough in winter and knowing medicine was 2 towns away. But Mara's fear was quieter than all of those. It went still. It folded itself behind her eyes and waited to be hurt. Seth stepped half a pace in front of her without thinking. Ben noticed and gave a soft laugh. Well, that is sweet. You found yourself a guard dog. Seth kept his voice even. Ride on. I came to speak with Mara. She does not look eager. Ben leaned forward in the saddle. He was younger than Seth by a few years, but the life on his face looked older. Drink had yellowed his eyes a little. Dust clung to the brim of his hat. His coat had once been fine, but now the cuffs were worn and one button hung by a thread. Mara and me go back, Ben said. Mara's voice came from behind Seth. No, we do not. Ben's smile thinned. Now that ain't kind. My father gave you a roof. Your father gave me work, she said, nothing more. And you thanked him by putting your hand where it did not belong. Seth turned his head slightly. Mara. She looked at him. You do not have to answer him. Ben laughed again. That is the trouble with women like her. They find one man willing to believe a sad face, and all at once the truth becomes rude. Seth took one slow step toward the horse. Ben's hand twitched near his coat, not toward a weapon but toward the inside pocket. Seth saw it and stopped. What is in your pocket? Seth asked. Ben's smile returned. Memory. He drew out a small cloth pouch and shook it. Coins clinked inside. Mara went pale. Seth looked back at her. What is that? Her mouth opened, but no words came. Ben held the pouch up. Recognize it, don't you, Mara? Her hands curled into her skirt. Seth's heart sank, not because he believed she had stolen it, but because shame had a cruel way of making innocent people look guilty. Ben watched them both and seemed to enjoy the silence. My father kept money in a drawer, he said. Everybody knows that part. What they do not know is some of it turned up years later, tucked in a flour tin after she was gone. Myra whispered, no. Oh yes, but father was too proud to say he might have made a mistake. Easier to keep the story as it was. Poor orphan girl stole from the house. Town believed it. Story done. Seth stared at him. Then why carry that pouch now? Ben's eyes sharpened, because stories can be useful twice. Mara looked as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. You found it. Ben shrugged. Maybe. You knew, she said. Her voice shook now, not with fear but with something deeper. You knew all these years. Ben's face hardened. I knew enough. Seth stepped closer. Enough for what? Ben looked at Mara, not Seth. Enough to know that if Red Hollow hears I found that money, Folks might ask who put it there. Mara's lips trembled. It was you. The words came so softly that the creek nearly swallowed them. Ben's smile vanished. Seth felt the truth settle in the space between them. Ben did not deny it. Myra took one step forward. You took it from your father. Ben's jaw worked. He had plenty. You hid it in my flour tin. You were leaving anyway. No, she said, stronger now. I was sent away because of you. A wind moved through the cottonwoods, turning the leaves silver. The creek made its soft running sound. Far ahead, the Miller wagon had stopped on the road, Mrs. Miller looking back with one hand raised to shade her eyes. Ben lowered the pouch. Careful, Mara. A woman with your name should not throw accusations. Seth's voice dropped. Her name is cleaner than yours. Ben looked at him with sudden dislike. You do not know what you are stepping into, Caldwell. I know enough. No, you don't. Ben pointed the pouch at Mara. Ask her why she never told anyone the drawer key went missing the day before the money disappeared. Ask her why she never said my older brother came into the kitchen that night. Ask her why she let them blame her so easy. Myra looked away. Seth turned toward her. Myra. For the first time since he had known her, she looked ashamed of something that was not the accusation. Ben gave a short, ugly laugh. There it is. She ain't telling you all of it. Mara's eyes filled with tears. Caleb Voss was drunk. He came into the kitchen after supper. I told him to leave. He said if I spoke of it, he would tell his father I had been sneaking food, and I had been. For children, Seth said quietly. She looked at him, startled. He remembered the Miller boy, the little girl with spilled coffee, the full piece of cornbread hidden beneath a cloth. Mara swallowed. There were 2 small children in a shack behind the mill. Their mother was sick. I took bread when I could, not money, bread. Ben's mouth curled. The town will hear thief either way. No, Seth said. Ben looked at him. Seth reached for Juniper's reins and untied them from the scrub branch. We are going to Sheriff Brand. Ben backed his horse a step. I ain't going anywhere. You will, Seth said, or I will ride to Cedar Gap with Mrs. Miller as witness to what you said here. Ben's face changed. For the first time he looked uncertain. Mara wiped her cheek quickly. Seth, stop. He turned. Why? Her gaze moved from him to Ben, then down the road toward Red Hollow. Because if this comes out, they will not only ask what Ben did, they will ask what I did too. You fed hungry children. I stole bread, she whispered. Seth looked at her, and his heart hurt with the terrible smallness of the crime she feared. Before he could answer, Ben pulled his horse around. I would think twice before making a saint of her, he called. Ask Greer why he really kept her on so long. Then he dug his heels in and rode north, dust rising behind him. Mara stood in the road, shaking, her eyes fixed on the place where Ben had disappeared. Seth stepped near her, careful not to touch. What did he mean about Greer? Mara closed her eyes. And when she opened them, Seth saw that Ben had not brought one secret back. He had brought the door to all of them. Mara did not answer Seth right away. The creek moved beside them, clear over stones, as if the world had no concern for the past rising between 2 people on a muddy road. The Miller wagon waited farther ahead, Mrs. Miller watching from a distance but kind enough not to come near. Juniper lowered her head to crop at the grass, calm as a Sunday horse, while Mara stood with her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. Seth wanted to ask again. He did not. He had learned by then that Mara spoke only when silence became heavier than the truth. At last she looked toward Red Hollow. Greer knew, she said. Seth's face hardened. About Ben. Not at first. Her voice was rough. But he knew the complaint was thin. He knew there had been no trial. When I came to his boarding house, I told him before anyone else could. I thought honesty might protect me. Did it? Myra gave a small, sad smile. No, it only taught him where the bruise was. The words landed deep in Seth. She looked down at the mud on her skirt. He said Red Hollow did not need to know, long as I worked hard, kept quiet, and remembered who had given me a chance. Seth understood then. Greer had not needed chains. He had used fear, food, a roof, and an old paper folded in a drawer. How long? Seth asked. 5 years. The number sat between them like a stone. Seth looked back toward town. 5 years and he kept your wages. Some months, not all. She tried to speak plainly, but her chin trembled once. There was always something I owed, a broken cup, extra flour, a room fee, medicine when I had fever. He said I would never find another place if people knew. He may have been right. He was not right. You do not know that. I know enough. Mara's eyes lifted to his. You know one road, one boarding house, one taste of cornbread. You do not know what it is to walk into a town and feel people decide your worth before you speak. Seth took that without defense because she was right. He had known loss. He had known loneliness. But he had never been a woman with a bad story pinned to her name like a notice on a church door. No, he said quietly, I do not. That answer seemed to disarm her more than any promise would have. Mrs. Miller called softly from the wagon. Mara, we should move before the creek rises. Mara wiped her face with the back of her wrist and nodded. I will ride with them to her sister, S. Seth felt the refusal before she said it. My offer still stands, he told her. Work at the ranch, no debt, no hidden paper, your own cabin. She looked at him for a long moment. In her eyes he saw want so clear it hurt. Want for shelter, for rest, for a door that closed without fear, for a kitchen where her hands could make something without being counted like a crime. Then she shook her head. If I come now, folks will say I ran from truth into your protection. Let them. I cannot build a life out of your not caring what they say. Her voice softened. I have to care, Seth, because when you ride into town, they see Caldwell land, Caldwell cattle, Caldwell name. When I walk in, they see Greer's cook and Voss's thief. You are neither. Then I have to prove it while standing on my own feet. The pride in her voice was not sharp. It was tired, but it was alive. Seth respected it even as it pained him. What will you do? I will go to Mrs. Miller's sister for a few days. Then I will look for work. Where? Somewhere Greer's voice does not reach. Seth nodded, though everything in him wanted to argue. Mara moved toward the wagon, then stopped. Without looking back, she said, Thank you for believing me before it was easy. He watched her climb into the wagon bed beside the children. The smallest Miller girl leaned against Mara's side, and Mara tucked the child's shawl closer around her shoulders with the same careful hands that had fed half of Red Hollow without thanks. The wagon rolled south. Seth stood in the road until it disappeared past the cottonwoods. By sunset, he was in Cedar Gap again. Sheriff Nolan Brand listened without interruption while Seth told him about Ben Voss, the coin pouch, the hidden money, and Mara's words. The sheriff's jaw tightened more with every sentence. I need Ben found, Seth said. Nolan leaned back in his chair. Finding him is easy. Making him talk in front of witnesses is harder. I heard him. And he will say you lied because you want the woman. Nolan's voice was not cruel, only honest. Greer will say she is trouble. Ben will say she fed poor children with stolen bread. Folks love truth until it asks them to change their mind. Seth looked at the complaint folder on the desk. Then what do we need? Someone from the Voss house. Someone who saw more than Myra did, or proof that money pouch belonged to Lyle Voss. Seth remembered Ben's words. Ask her why she never said my older brother came into the kitchen that night. Caleb Voss, Seth said. The sheriff nodded slowly. Older brother, runs freight out of Abilene now, comes through once in a while. He was wild then but not as rotten as Ben. Can you send for him? I can, but if he helped hide the truth he may not answer. Seth stood, then I will go find him. Nolan rose too. You have a ranch. I have hands. You have a temper. Seth put on his hat. I have a reason. He rode home under a darkening sky, mind turning over every piece of the past. When he reached the Caldwell ranch, Amos was waiting by the barn lantern. She come back with you? The old hand asked. No. Amos nodded, disappointed but not surprised. Seth unsaddled Juniper. I am leaving for Abilene at first light. Amos looked sharply at him. For the Voss boy. For the truth. Before Amos could answer, a horse came hard up the road from town. Its rider bent low in the saddle, coat flapping behind him. It was the young kitchen girl from Greer's boarding house. She slid down before the horse fully stopped, breathless and frightened. Mr. Caldwell, she gasped, you got to come quick. Seth stepped toward her. What happened? Her eyes filled with tears. Greer found out Mara talked. He's gone after her. Seth did not wait for more. He took the reins from the kitchen girl's shaking hands and turned to Amos. Saddle Ranger. Amos was already moving. Juniper's done for the day. Ranger still has legs. The ranch yard stirred awake under the lantern light. One hand came from the bunkhouse pulling on his coat. Another opened the barn doors. The kitchen girl stood with her arms wrapped around herself, her face pale from the ride. Seth stepped close enough that she would hear him clearly, but not so close that he frightened her. Tell me which road. She went south with Mrs. Miller. Greer heard at the mercantile that they stopped at the old Harper place because the baby took sick. He was angry, Mr. Caldwell, real angry. Said Mara had stolen from him now too. What did he say she stole? The girl swallowed. His good name. For a second Seth could not speak. The cruelty of it was so plain and small that it sickened him. Greer had used Mara's hands, her work, her fear, and her silence for 5 years. Now he was calling her the thief for leaving. Amos came back leading Ranger, a strong chestnut with a white mark down his nose. I'm coming, Amos said. Seth shook his head. Stay here. If I am not back by morning, ride to Sheriff Brand. You will need help. I need speed. Amos looked as if he hated the answer, but he gave Seth the reins. Then keep your head cooler than your blood. Seth swung into the saddle and rode hard into the dark. The south road looked different at night. Cottonwoods became black shapes. The creek flashed silver only where the moon touched it. Ranger's hooves struck sparks from stones, then softened in mud, then thundered again on dry ground. Seth leaned low and let the horse run. He thought of Mara in the wagon bed with the Miller children, proud enough to refuse his shelter, brave enough to face the world on her own feet. He thought of her saying, I have to prove it while standing on my own feet. Now Greer was riding after those feet with another chain. The old Harper place sat 3 miles beyond the creek crossing, a small abandoned cabin with a leaning chimney and a shed that had lost half its roof in a windstorm years before. Travelers sometimes used it when weather turned. Seth saw the glow of a lantern through the cottonwoods before he saw the house. He slowed Ranger. Voices carried in the cold air. Greer's voice came first. You think hiding with a widow makes you righteous. Then Mara's. I am not hiding. Seth dismounted behind the trees and moved closer on foot. The Miller wagon stood near the cabin. One of the horses was still hitched head low, worn from the road. Inside the cabin, a baby cried weakly. Mrs. Miller stood in the doorway with a blanket around her shoulders, one hand holding a lamp. Greer stood in the yard, hat pushed back, face red in the lantern light. Mara stood between him and the cabin door. Not behind Mrs. Miller. Not in the shadows. Between. Seth stopped at the edge of the clearing. Something held him there for a breath. It was not fear. It was the sight of Mara Bell standing exactly where she had always been afraid to stand, in full view, with no apron in her hands and no kitchen door to escape through. Greer pointed at her. "You belong back at my boarding house until your account is settled." "My account was settled in years of work you never paid fair." "You ungrateful girl." "I am not a girl." Her voice shook, but it did not break. Greer stepped closer. "You think Caldwell will save you?" Mara lifted her chin. "This is not about Seth Caldwell." Seth felt his own name like a rope tugging him forward, but he stayed still. This was Mara's moment, and he understood enough now not to take it from her. Greer laughed. "Without him, you are nothing but the same orphan thief I took pity on." Mrs. Miller spoke from the doorway. "That is enough." Greer snapped his gaze at her. "Stay out of this." Mara moved one step, blocking him from looking into the cabin. "Do not speak to her that way." "Or what?" Mara's hands trembled at her sides. She saw it too and pressed them into her skirt. "Or I will stop being silent." Greer's face changed. "If this moment makes you believe quiet people often carry the heaviest truth, stay with Mara now, because silence is finally leaving her." Greer lowered his voice. "Careful." "No," Mara said. "I have been careful for 5 years. I was careful when you kept my wages because you said I owed for a roof. I was careful when you told folks I was lucky to have work. I was careful when you showed that old complaint to shame me in your dining room." Seth saw Mrs. Miller's eyes widen. Mara took a breath. "I was careful because I was afraid, but I am more afraid of staying what you made me." Greer looked toward the road, suddenly aware that any traveler might hear. "You have no proof." "Neither did they," Mara said. The words cut clean. Greer stepped forward too fast. Seth came out of the trees at once. "That is far enough." Greer turned, startled. Seth walked into the lantern light, one hand open at his side, the other holding his hat. He did not reach for the rifle in the saddle. He did not need to. His voice carried all the warning required. "Leave," Seth said. Greer tried to gather himself. "This is not your matter." "It became my matter when you chased a woman down a road at night to drag her back into fear. I came for what I am owed." Seth looked at Mara. "Does she owe you?" Mara looked back at him. The old fear was still there, but something stronger stood beside it now. "No," she said. Seth turned to Greer. "There is your answer." Greer's lips pulled tight. "You two think this ends because she says a brave word by lantern light. Tomorrow I will have every man in Red Hollow asking why Caldwell is protecting a thief." "Tomorrow," a new voice said from the road, "they may ask a different question." Everyone turned. A rider had stopped near the clearing, his horse lathered from hard travel. The man swung down slowly, tired and broad-shouldered, with a freight rider's coat and a face Seth had never seen but somehow knew. The man looked at Mara first, then at Greer. "My name is Caleb Voss," he said, "and I know who stole my father's money." Caleb Voss stood in the lantern light like a man who had ridden through years to reach that yard. No one spoke at first. The baby's weak crying came from inside the Harper cabin. A horse stamped near the wagon. Somewhere beyond the cottonwoods, the creek moved in the dark, steady and cold. Mara stared at Caleb, as if she were looking at a ghost who had aged into a man. He took one step forward, then stopped when he saw her draw back. "I won't come closer unless you say," Caleb said. Those words seemed to strike Mara harder than his name had. In the Voss house, men had never asked before stepping into her space. They had taken rooms, taken food, taken truth, and left her to clean up after them. Seth watched her closely. She did not invite Caleb nearer, but she did not run. Greer recovered first. "This is none of your concern." Caleb turned to him. "It became my concern the day my family ruined an innocent girl and let her carry it." Greer's face tightened. "You were a boy then." "I was old enough to know when my brother lied." Mara's hand went to her throat. Seth looked at Caleb. "Say it plain." Caleb removed his hat. His hair was damp with sweat from the ride, and his eyes carried the heavy look of a man who had not slept easy in a long time. "Ben stole the money from our father," he said. $23 from the desk drawer. He took the key from father's coat after supper. I saw him with it." Mara closed her eyes. The truth she had waited years to hear did not free her at once. It hit her like weather. Seth could see her trying to stand beneath it. Caleb went on. "I followed him to the kitchen. He was drunk on cider and mean with it. Mara was there cleaning pans. Ben put the money in her flour tin because he thought father would search the kitchen first. Then when father did, there it was." Mrs. Miller stepped down from the cabin doorway, holding the lamp higher. "And you said nothing." Caleb looked at her, then at Mara. "No," he said, "I said nothing." Mara opened her eyes. "Why?" Her voice was not loud. That made the question worse. Caleb swallowed. "Because my father was hard. Because Ben was my brother. Because I was a coward. I told myself I would speak later. Then they sent you away before morning and later kept moving farther from me every year." Mara's face twisted, but she held herself still. "Later did not come for me." "I know." "No," she said, and now her voice shook. "You do not know. You got to grow older with your name still yours. I had to carry yours like dirt on my dress." Caleb lowered his head. Seth felt the pain in her words move through the yard. It did not need shouting. It did not need tears. It was strong because it had waited so long. Greer pointed toward the road. "This proves nothing. A man can say anything by a lantern." Caleb reached inside his coat. Seth's body tensed, but Caleb only pulled out a folded sheet and a small leather pouch. He held them toward Seth. "My father wrote a letter before he died," Caleb said. "He never sent it. I found it last winter in his trunk. He knew Ben had taken the money. He knew after, but pride kept him from correcting the story." Seth took the paper and opened it near Mrs. Miller's lamp. The writing was shaky and old, but clear enough. Lyle Voss had written that the Bell girl had been wronged, that his son Benjamin had stolen the money, that he had lacked the courage to tell the orphan home, the sheriff, or the town because he could not bear his own house being known for the crime. At the bottom was his name. Seth looked at Mara. "It is here." She did not move. Caleb held up the pouch. "This is the same money. Ben kept it as a joke first, then as a threat. He showed it to me when I found him in Abilene last month, drunk and bragging. I took it from him." Greer's eyes went cold. "Why bring it now?" Caleb looked at Seth. "Sheriff Brand's wire reached the freight office. Said Caldwell was asking. I knew if I stayed away one more time, I would be no better than the boy I was." The yard went silent again. Then Mara laughed once. It was not a happy sound. It was small and broken. "All this time," she said, "all this time the truth had paper in a pouch." Seth stepped closer, still careful. "Mara." She shook her head. "No, let me feel it." So he did. She stood there under the lantern, letting the truth hurt before it healed. A woman could not be called thief for years and become free in one breath. Freedom had to find its way into places fear had lived too long. Greer began backing toward his horse. "This is a family matter from Cedar Gap. Red Hollow need not be troubled. Mrs. Miller lifted the lamp higher. Her tired face had gone hard. Red Hollow was troubled when you showed that old paper in your dining room. Caleb turned to Greer. You used that complaint to keep her under your roof. Greer sneered. I gave her work. You gave her fear and called it mercy, Seth said. For once, Greer had no easy answer. A rider came down the road fast, then another behind him. Sheriff Nolan Brand entered the clearing with Amos Pike at his side. Amos must have ignored Seth's order to wait, and for the first time in his life, Seth was grateful for disobedience. Sheriff Brand dismounted and looked at the group. Seems I missed the beginning. Seth handed him the letter. You made it in time for the truth, he said. The sheriff read it slowly. His face darkened with every line. When he finished, he folded the paper with care and placed it inside his coat. Silas Greer, he said, you will come with me to Red Hollow in the morning and open that ledger of yours. Greer's face went pale. On what charge? On suspicion that you held wages by false debt. We will let the judge find the proper name for it. Then he looked at Caleb and Ben Voss. Caleb's jaw tightened. He is heading north. Sheriff Brand nodded. Then I will send word ahead. Myra spoke suddenly. No. Everyone turned. Her face was wet now, but her eyes were clear. I want the town to hear the truth first, she said. Not whispered, not guessed, not twisted by morning coffee. Seth understood before she finished. Mara looked at the sheriff. If my shame was made public, then my clearing will be public too. Sheriff Brand studied her, then nodded. At the church steps tomorrow. Greer cursed under his breath. Mara turned to Seth. For the first time that night, she looked not rescued but standing. I will go back to Red Hollow, she said, not behind you. Seth held her gaze. No, he answered softly, beside me. And as dawn began to pale the edge of the eastern sky, Mara Bell climbed into the wagon by her own strength, carrying the truth in front of her like a lantern that had finally been lit. But none of them knew that by sunrise, Ben Voss would reach Red Hollow first. Ben Voss reached Red Hollow before the truth did. By the time the wagon rolled into town, the morning sun had climbed over the roofs, and half the town had already gathered near the church steps. Men stood with coffee cups in their hands. Women held shawls tight around their shoulders. Children peered from behind skirts and porch posts, sensing that something important was about to happen, even if they did not know what. Ben stood at the foot of the steps like a preacher of lies. She fooled them, he was saying when Mara arrived. She fooled Caldwell, fooled the sheriff, and now she means to fool all of you. Ask yourselves why a woman runs in the night if she has nothing to hide. A few faces turned toward the wagon. Mara felt every look. For years, looks had been the worst part, not words, not even hunger. Looks had a way of touching old wounds without leaving marks. She sat still beside Mrs. Miller, her hands folded in her lap, the letter inside her coat like a small fire. Seth rode beside the wagon. He saw her face and wanted to speak for her. Then Mara stepped down before he could. Not quickly, not proudly in a showy way. She climbed down with mud still on her hem and tiredness around her eyes, but her back was straight. The whole town watched as she walked toward the church steps. Ben's smile faltered. Greer stood near the mercantile, pale and silent. Sheriff Brand had brought him in before dawn and kept him near, along with the ledger from the boarding house. Caleb Voss stood beside the sheriff, his hat in both hands, looking like a man ready to face the judgment he had earned too late. Mara stopped in front of the crowd. For a moment, the town heard only a horse shifting near the hitching rail, and the faint creak of the church sign in the wind. Then Mara spoke. My name is Mara Bell, she said. Some of you know me as Greer's cook. Some of you know me from a story told about me before I ever came here. Ben gave a sharp laugh. A true story. Myra turned her head toward him. No, a useful one. The crowd stirred. Sheriff Brand stepped forward and held up the old complaint. Years ago, Lyle Voss accused Mara Bell of stealing money from his house. There was no charge, no trial, no proof. Then he lifted the letter. But last night proof came. Caleb Voss walked up the steps. His voice shook at first, but he did not stop. My brother Ben stole that money, he said. I saw enough to know it then, and I was too weak to speak. My father learned the truth later and hid it because pride mattered more to him than a girl's name. Ben's face darkened. You liar. Caleb looked at him with deep sadness. I have been that for years, not today. Sheriff Brand opened the pouch and poured the old coins into his palm. The sound of them rang across the steps, small and hard. This money was found in Ben Voss's possession, the sheriff said, and this letter, written by Lyle Voss, names his own son. A sound moved through the crowd, not anger at first, shame, the heavy, uncomfortable kind that comes when decent people realize they let a lie live because it was easier than asking questions. Mrs. Miller stepped forward with her baby in her arms. Mara fed my children when I had nothing to give them. The young kitchen girl raised her voice from near the boarding house porch. She worked harder than any of us. Mr. Greer kept her scared with that paper. Sheriff Brand turned to Greer, and his ledger shows wages held back under debts no honest court would call fair. Greer looked around for a friendly face and found none. Ben tried to move toward his horse, but Amos Pike stepped into his path, calm and broad as a gate. The sheriff nodded to his deputy, and a moment later Ben was led away without one shot fired, without one fist raised. Only truth walked him down that street, and truth was enough. Mara watched it happen, but no joy came to her face. Justice did not erase years. It only opened the door. Seth stepped beside her, not in front. You did it, he said softly. Mara looked at the crowd. Some faces were wet. Some could not meet her eyes. Old Mrs. Rusk came down from the mercantile porch and took Mara's flower-scarred hand between both of hers. We looked past you too long, the old woman said. Mara's mouth trembled. I learned to make it easy. No, Mrs. Rusk said, that was our failing. Those words nearly broke her. By afternoon, Greer's boarding house was closed until the judge could settle his accounts. The kitchen girl and two women from town helped Mara gather what little belonged to her. There was not much: a spare dress, a cracked comb, a tin cup, a folded apron, a small recipe book made from scraps of paper tied with string. Seth waited outside by the wagon. When Mara came out, she looked at him carefully. Is the offer still standing? The job, the work, the cabin, the lock from the inside. Seth smiled, but only a little. All of it. She nodded. Then I will come on trial. For how long? Mara looked toward the street where people no longer looked past her, but did not quite know how to look at her yet. Long enough to see if it suits. Months passed. At the Caldwell ranch, Mara took the kitchen like it had been waiting for her hands. She fed the men, planted herbs by the fence, and kept a jar of yellow wildflowers on the windowsill. She still moved quietly, but not like a shadow anymore. She sat at supper now. Seth made sure the second chair stayed pulled out, but he never made a show of it. One evening, with the first winter snow falling beyond the glass, Seth found her by the stove making cornbread. He watched her hands work, steady and sure. Mara, he said, why did that first piece taste different? She did not look up, because it was not meant for customers. He stepped closer. She smiled softly, though tears brightened her eyes. It was mine. I had saved it for my supper. I gave the last of it to you because you looked tired, and I thought one person in that room should eat something made with care. Seth's throat tightened. You went hungry. That night, she said, but you saw me. He reached for her hand, and this time she let him take it without fear. If this story reminded you that one small kindness can change a whole life, subscribe for more emotional Wild West stories where love, truth, and healing find their way home. Years later, folks in Red Hollow would still talk about the day Mara Bell's name was given back to her on the church steps, but Seth remembered something quieter. A woman in a brown dress, a warm piece of cornbread, and the moment he realized some hearts are not won by grand promises, but by finally seeing the person everyone else had forgotten.